Hello everyone. Today's topic is going to be arrays, and arrays, you'll find arrays in every programming language. It's just the differences maybe in how they work and the syntax, but the concept of arrays exists in pretty much every programming language. So what is an array? Well, an array is a collection of data. So far in this class, we've used variables to store a single piece of data, such as a number or a string or a boolean, but an array is used to store more than one value. So some of you might be thinking, well, objects store more than one value because objects have properties in them. Well, that's true, but so far when we've used variables to refer to objects, the variable is only referring to a single object. So we can actually create arrays that contain many objects. So when we write programs, we often need to work with large collections of data. For example, you probably wouldn't write a program to keep track of a single book. Instead, it would be more useful to keep track of an entire collection of books, maybe if you're building software for a library or something like that. So let's take a look at our first code example here, which is right here. Okay, so what we've got is we're creating a variable called myTestScores, and what we're storing in it is an array. And now you can tell because of the syntax. Arrays are enclosed in these square brackets in JavaScript. Now there's a couple other different syntaxes you can use to create arrays, but we're going to try and stick with this one because I think it's the most common, and I'll briefly touch on those other ways a little bit later. So this array is it's an array of numbers storing what is presumably test scores from looking at the variable name. But let's take a look at the syntax a little bit deeper. So as I mentioned, arrays, the data in an array is enclosed within square brackets. And notice that each separate value in the array is separated by a comma. And also note that there is no comma after the last value. It's not necessary to put one after the last value. In fact, I think that would cause an error if you just had a comma here after the 77. So make sure you take a moment to study the syntax, because we know that the first step to mastering a language is coming to terms with the syntax. And then I just want to point out before we dig in too deep is that in the next lesson we'll cover loops, and loops are things that we can use to process lots of data in arrays, and that's when our programs can really become powerful, when we're working with large sets of data. But for now, you'll have to sit tight and bear with me while we go over some of the details of arrays. So let's move on down to the next code snippet here. You can see this is an array that holds strings, unlike the previous array. And I just want to show you what happens if you console.log an array. So I'm going to switch over to Sublime Text. Well, first I'm going to copy this code snippet here, and I want you to do this with me. And then we'll go make sure you have the file open in Sublime Text, and we'll scroll down and start looking for that script tag that we like to use as our little playground, which is around, looks like 192 or so. So I'll go ahead and paste in that code sample and save it. Now I'm going to go back over to Sublime Text, or I'm sorry, the browser, and I'll hit F12 to open up the developer tools, and then I will make sure my console is open. I'll hit refresh here, and there you can see, here's this line right here is our console output. So you can see that when you log an array, so what I've got here is I've just created a variable that holds an array. This happens to be an array of strings. And then right here I take that variable and I pass it into the console.log function. Actually, method, I should say. The console.log method. Got to be particular. Anyways, don't worry about that right now. Here's what I get when I log an array. So it basically shows me the contents of the array. Okay, so that's always useful when you kind of want to check to see what's in an array. I'll go ahead and close the developer tools for the moment and scroll on down to the next example. Now, in some programming languages, when you create an array, you can only store the same data type throughout the whole array. So in the previous examples, we're storing just numbers in the first array, and in the second example, we're storing just strings. Now, some languages say that you can only store one data type, that meaning everything in the array has to be of the same data type. But JavaScript is a little bit different. So right here, I've got this variable called mixed array, and what I'm assigning to it is an array that holds a number, and then the next thing in it is a string, and then the last thing in the array is a Boolean. So JavaScript is a little bit unique in this regard because you can mix your data types inside of an array. All right, so each value in an array is called an element. So the first element is here, the second element is here, and the third element is here. Now don't get these confused with HTML elements. It's the same word, but when you're talking about HTML, elements refer to the tag, or the tag and what's inside of it. Opening tag, what's inside of it, and then the closing tag. That's an element. But in JavaScript, elements are used to refer to the values that are stored in an array. Okay, so each element in an array has a specific position which is known as its index. Okay, now let me tell you a little more details here. And the indexes start with 0, and that'll trip up beginners. And so what that means is, if I go back to this array up here, the index of this first element is 0. The index of the second element is 1. And then the index of the third element is 2. So we have a tendency to kind of want our indexes to start with 1. But, and like I said, this will trip you up, but our indexes start at 0. So this is index 0, index 1, index 2. But note that the length of our array, meaning the number of elements, is 3. So the length of the array is always going to be 1 greater than the highest index. So in this example, the highest index here is 2. 0, 1, 2. And the length of the array is 3. 1, 2, 3. So the highest index number in an array will always be 1 less than the length of the array, and that'll come in into play in a little bit here. Now, why do we need indexes for arrays? Well, that's how we retrieve values from an array. So if we scroll down to this example here, we can see that I've got an array. This is the same array that we've been using previously, and it's got 4 elements in it. So 0, 1, whoops. That's index 1, index 2, index 3. So 4 elements, the highest index is 3. So when we want to retrieve values from an array, we can use that index number. So for example, I've got a variable here called first test, and I'm retrieving the first element, which has an index of 0, from this array, my test scores. So if I were to console.log this variable, it would console.log 96. Okay, so and then I'm just going down and removing, or not removing, but I'm just pulling the value out of each out of the array, one element at a time. So second test, that would give me 85 over here, and notice these index numbers. So note that we're using bracket notation here, and what we put inside the brackets is the index number of the element that we want to retrieve from the array. Okay, so we can also use bracket notation to update these values. So let's scroll down to this example here. So I've got the same array that we've been working with, and then I don't know why I have this console.log here. I'm not sure why I did that, but anyways, this is the line I want you to focus on right there. And what that's doing is we're saying take the element at index 3 and change it to a 100. So what that would do, index 3 is this one. So remember 0, 1, 2, 3. So after this line of code runs here, that means that the last element is going to have a value of 100 because we updated it. So let's just go ahead and copy this code real quick and run it over in Sublime Text, or paste it over into Sublime Text. So I'll go ahead, put it in Sublime Text, and you should do this too if you really want to get familiar with all this stuff. So I'll save that, and I guess I'm not formatting so much anymore. Maybe I got to keep paying attention to my formatting. Go back over to the browser here, hit F12 to bring up the console, and then I will refresh. And oh, I have an error here. Hang on. All right, so I will have fixed this by the time you watch this video, but I forgot I had a typo right here. So the problem is I declare this variable called myTestScores with an S here, and then down here I'm referring to myTestScore. So that's why I got this reference error right here. It's saying myTestScore is not defined. All right, so I'm going to fix that real quick, and then you won't have to worry about it. All right, so I fixed it, and I've added that S there, and then I'll save this again and go back over to the browser and hit refresh here. And you'll see here that we've updated that last element in the array. It started out as 77, and then we updated it with this line of code right here basically, and now that last element is 100. So we can use bracket notation to fetch elements from an array, and we can also use bracket notation to update or change the values that are in an array. Okay, I'm going to close the console or the developer tools here, and now a lot of times we start with an empty array and then we can build it up as we go, and that's something that you can do in JavaScript that you can't necessarily do in other languages too. In other languages you have to specify how many elements are going to be in the array when you create it, and then you have to stick with that, and that's kind of limiting. But the nice thing about JavaScript is our arrays can grow and shrink as our program runs, which is really nice. So let's take a look at this example right here. So I'm creating an array called test scores, and then I'm adding elements to it. So right here I'm saying at the first index, let's give it a value of whatever this evaluates to. So you know what the prompt does. It's going to ask somebody to enter a test score. So basically, as this program runs, you're going to see 3 prompts and asking you to enter test scores, and by the time you're done you'll have an array full of test scores. So I won't run this now just to save some time, but I encourage you to copy this and paste it into our script tag and run it and play around with it and make some changes and tinker with it. And that's really how you get good at programming, is just by tinkering with these simple little examples. Okay, moving on down. Now, arrays are actually objects. They're a special type of object, and we've been talking a lot about objects, and you know by now that objects have properties and they have methods, and we can actually use these properties and methods when we're working with arrays. So we'll talk about methods of arrays in a little bit, but right now I want to talk about one particular property that you can use of an array, and that is the length property. So right here in this code sample right here, I've got our familiar array here, my test scores, and it's got 4 elements in it. And then what I'm doing is I'm console.logging the length. So we know that with properties we use the dot operator to access properties of an object. So here's what represents my object. That's my variable, and this so happens to contain an array. Arrays are objects. So I can use the dot operator to access properties of that object. So I've got my dot here, and then I want to access the property here. And so when you access the length property, what it'll tell you is how many elements are in the array. So if you run this code here, you'll see the console log will show 4, because there's 4 elements in this array. So in this next example here, I'm going to show you how we're going to use that length property. So I've got an array called friends, and it's got a list of my friends. So here we go. Now, what I could do if I wanted to add an element to this array is I could put a 3 here instead of what I have. But what I've got is my array variable name, and then the length. So this is going to evaluate to 3. So basically this is just a placeholder for what's going to be 3 when this code runs here. And then what I'm doing is I'm adding Pat to the array. So by the time this line of code runs, we'll have an array that has Betty, Sally, Bob, and Pat in it. Now, like I said, I could just put a 3 here if I wanted to, but in most cases it's much better to do this, myFriends.length. And the reason why is because what if I change this array up here? What if I added 4 more names to this list and I forget to update this line of code? Well, what's that going to do then? If I had a 3 here, then what that would really be doing is updating one of the elements that already exist. So I want you to resist the temptation to hard code your indexes. Okay, I know that's a little bit confusing, but anyways, the nice thing about this bracket notation is that whatever's inside these brackets will be evaluated, and we can use that to our advantage. It makes our programs more flexible. So this will get evaluated. In this case, it'll get evaluated to be a 3, and it will add Pat at index 3 in our array. But like I said, if our code above were to change for some reason and we forget to update this, maybe we added a few more names to this array, but we forgot to update what would be a 3 here. Everything will still work if we're using myFriends.length. We'll be adding Pat to the end of the array. But if we had hard-coded a 3 here instead, then we would actually be overwriting one of the values that's already in the array. Let me know if that's confusing for you. We'll talk about that in class. Likewise, we can use the .length property to pull the last element out of an array. So let's say we're not exactly sure what the length of the array is going to be when we're writing our code. So we can't use a hard-coded number. We can't use just a number value. But what we can do is we can use the length property. So remember, the length is always going to be 1 greater than the highest index. So what I've got going on here is my friends array. And then right here, if I want to get the last element out of the array, my last friend here, I refer to my variable, and then I'm using bracket notation, and then this expression will get evaluated. So in this case, it'll get evaluated to 2 because the length of the array is 3, and then we subtract 1 here, and that will evaluate to 2, and that will give us Bob. So remember, index is 0, 1, 2. So the value of this variable, my last friend, will be storing Bob after this line of code runs. And you can go ahead and try that in the script tag and see how it works. And again, this would be better than hard coding a 2 right here, because like I said, things always change when you're programming, and if I changed my array up above to have more elements in it, then the index that I want to get the last array out would change. So this allows our code to be more flexible, and it adapts to our code rather than just hard coding a number right inside these brackets. We can use these expressions to return the last element, no matter how many elements, no matter how our array changes throughout the course of running our program. Okay, with that in mind, I want you to take a look at this code snippet here. Actually, what I want you to do is I want you to go ahead and copy this and paste it into our little script tag playground and run it and see if you can make sense of what's going on here. But we are leveraging the fact that in bracket notation, what you put inside the brackets will be evaluated. So go ahead and see if you can, well, you know what, let's do this together. I'll go ahead and we'll talk about this. So I'm going to copy this code sample. I'm going to take it over to Sublime Text, and I will delete my previous example here. Then I'll paste this, and then I'm going to do a little bit of formatting. So it's like that. So what I've got here is an array with 3 elements in it, 0, 1, 2, and so the length is 3. And then we're prompting the user to enter a valid index number for this array. And then whatever they enter in that prompt box is going to get stored in X here. And then look at what we do on the next line down here. So whatever they entered, let's say they entered a 0, we can basically evaluate this X to 0. and it will pull out the first element in the array, and that will be stored in this variable here. Okay, and then we've just got an if statement here. So this is a trick that we talked about back when we talked about if statements, and this will protect our code from crashing, and I'll show you why in a second here. So I'm going to go ahead and save this, and then I'm going to go back over to the browser and run it, and we'll see enter a valid index number for the my friends array. So I'll enter a 1 here. So this will give us the second element from the array. And what did I do? Did I not? Let's see. Okay, I need to open the console.log to see the output. So I forgot to do that. And here we see in the log, it says the value of the element at index 1, remember I entered 1, is Sally. So here's Sally at index 1, 0, 1. Okay, now this if statement down here is going to catch for errors. So let me show you what happens here. I'm going to refresh the page here, and I'm going to enter some garbage. So I'm just going to enter some, I'm not even thinking about what I'm entering right here. But look at what we get here is there is no element at index SSSS in this array. And that's this line of code running right here. So what we're doing is we're using an if statement to make sure that our selected element variable here is valid. Because if X is garbage, then this is going to be garbage too. We'll talk about that more later. Okay, I'm going to close the console. We're almost done here. I'm trying to keep these videos somewhat short, but I wanted to show you here. Now there are other ways of creating arrays, and what I mean by that is you can use other syntaxes, but I think to try and keep things simple, we'll just stick with that bracket, the brackets like what I showed you. But you will see other people who, if you look at other developers' code, they might use various methods, and one of them is this. So you could create an array like this and put these elements in it. Now I don't want to talk about this too much. I just wanted to make you aware that you might see this syntax if you look at other people's code. But we'll stick to our approach. So we'll use brackets for creating our arrays. And finally, one thing I want to point out is I've showed you arrays that store numbers and strings and booleans, but when programming really becomes powerful, we can store objects in arrays. So look at what I've got going on here. I've got an empty array that I'm creating here, and I'm assigning that empty array to this variable called books. And then here in the next line down, I'm adding an element to the array, and look at what I'm adding. So I'm adding an object. Okay? So, and then on the third line here, I'm adding another object. So we can have arrays of objects, and when you work with arrays of objects, that's when you can really start to process complicated data, and we'll be doing that soon, but I need to teach you about loops first, which is coming up next. Okay, so this is one way to build this array here, and notice that I did it in 3 statements. So here's my first statement. Our statements end with semicolons, and then so after this line of code runs, we'll have an empty array. After this line of code runs, we'll have an array with 1 element in it, and after this line of code runs, we'll have an array with 2 elements in it, and both those elements will be objects. Okay, now I can create an array of objects in a single statement. So right here I've got my variable books and then my square brackets, and then I'm putting those 2 objects right inside this array, and they're separated by commas. So this is really no different than what we saw way up here, right here, but I just want to point out that in this example we're storing numbers, and in the other example that I just showed you we're storing objects. Now this is all on one line, and I could have, I'm going to scroll back down to that last code sample, I could have made this all one line, but it'd be harder to read then. So I could have done this exact code and taken out the line breaks. But when things get hairy and it gets hard to read, so that's why I broke it up over multiple lines. Okay, I think that's going to do it for our introduction on arrays.